Yes, so in this paper this morning, I'm going to be looking at a particular vessel form, a distinctive small spouted vessel that usually, due to its recovery from infant burials, is often referred to as an infant feeding bottle. And just before I get started, I just wanted to say that although I'm not going to be showing any images of human remains, I am going to be talking about infant mortality. There are images of grave plans and vessels from burials. Because this can be an emotive subject, I just wanted to put that information out there in case there's anybody here who doesn't want to go there this morning. Okay, moving on. Could I have the next slide, please? So as you can see here, these vessels can be subject to a range of interpretations and descriptions across publications and in museum catalogue listings. Very few are descriptive, most pertain to an assumed function. And Peter Webster in 1981 wrote about the unusual Samian feeding cup form and drew together other examples known at the time. Since then, more have come to light in Britain, usually with a short discussion and a suggestion, again, that they're probably infant feeding bottles due to their context of recovery. In addition, there's been more work on isotope analysis in recent years, which has explored weaning practices in both Britain and on the continent, and programs of lipid analysis conducted on some of these vessels for both the prehistoric and some Roman. And again, that's mostly been undertaken on the continent. So all these factors considered, it seemed like a good time to revisit the Roman examples in Britain. And I first became interested in this form over a decade ago, actually probably nearer to 2 decades. But my interest was reignited again recently while I was working on an assemblage that included 2 of these vessels from an infant cremation burial at a site undertaken by ASE in Essex. Now, unlike my previous paper yesterday, which was mostly graphs, today I promise you pictures of pots. Okay. And Eniko, can I have the next slide, please? Here we go, pots. So what are these vessels? Some of you will already be familiar with them. And here I just want to say a big thank you to all the SGRP members who over a number of years have responded to my requests and have sent me examples. As we have such a wide audience, just as a quick explanation, you know, they are characterized by having a spout. As you can see here, it can protrude from the lower body or the midway point. Generally, they have a very small borehole. They are small, a height range of 60 to 150 millimeters. The girth of the vessels ranges from between sort of 60 to 98 millimeters. And as you can see on the images on the screen, you know, there's quite a lot of variety. These particular examples, I think the writing's dropped off the bottom. 4 to the left are some examples from York. The ones on the right, as you look at the screen, are some of the examples from Museum of London. They may or they may not have handles. Where they do occur, they can be opposite the spout or at 90 degrees to the spout. And you can see there's a wide variety in rim form as well. There's also a lot of variety in fabrics. So in Britain, we have imported vessels. Excuse me a minute. We have the Samian examples, which formed the basis for Peter Webster's article in 1981. And that's, I think that's, you know, the largest category of imported vessels, although we do have some from Central Gaul as well. And you can see to the right of this screen, that one is from Trier. Whatever their function, they were well enough known to be produced in local fabrics in Britain. And you can see some on here, and could I have the next slide, please? And here as well. We have an example from the New Forest, the one on the bottom left. It looks quite different to the others, black and white photograph as well. That's thought to be from the Linwood kilns and possibly 3rd century. We also have example from, in a North Wiltshire oxidized fabric, that's not on the screen, 2 vessels from Widdowspool, which we'll look at in a minute, were also thought to be made of a local redware. We have vessels for the beryllium industry recorded in London. The examples I have from Essex seem to be in local buff fabrics. I noticed Nile Valley was mentioned in the latest JPRS, so I will be following that one up. York, there are some described as being in Ebbowware, I hope I've said that right. And in Holt, I followed up this reference, and Evan Chapman at the National Museum of Wales was brilliant and went and hunted out the fragments for me. And you can see one on the bottom right of the screen as you look at it, which is again thought to be locally produced. Military site at Longthorpe, Cambridgeshire, seem to have been producing them. North Kent in Jason Moynihan's volume, I think they're Form 13, and they feature in the Rowland's Castle typology as well. And in terms of date, most appear to be early 2nd to 3rd century. We do have some earlier examples. The one from Colchester, from the so-called Child's Grave, that's dated sort of AD 50 to 65. And there's a small group of cremations from Kingswood in Surrey that may just fall into the late 1st to early 2nd century. And like I've said, the latest one I've come across so far, although I haven't seen it in person, is this one here from Rockbourne. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so it's a very basic map, just to show the fine spots, but not the quantities. Obviously, some of these areas have more than one, but just to give a rough idea of the distribution at the moment. And I don't entirely believe this distribution. I think there are more lurking that will fill in some of these gaps. And obviously after this, if anybody knows of any more, please do let me know. A lot of the vessels are located in museum collections. They're from antiquarian excavations, so the context isn't always as good as we would perhaps like. And there is also the chance that the presence alone of one of these vessels was enough to assign the grave to a child. And the identification obviously is based on the presence of the spout. So without it, we'd probably record them as small beakers or small jars. And it's also important to acknowledge they don't just occur in ceramics. In the UK, we have 3 known examples, 2 from Colchester and 1 from Lankills in Winchester, of glass vessels reported on by Hilary Cool. And the one in Lankills was found with a child with a minimum age of 5, so again later than most of the other examples. And what's interesting there is that Hilary Cool made the point that the Colchester examples are probably 2nd to 3rd century, as are most of the ceramic examples, which would mean that the one at Lankills could potentially have been in circulation for 100 years or so before being deposited. But they're not all located in burials. At Enfield in London, one was recovered from the fill of an oven, Piercebridge from a courtyard deposit, and another from a ditch fill. Some villa examples, Star Villa in Somerset recorded one from a flooring layer, a makeup layer, sorry, in room 1, and actually described them there as lamp fillers. And we have the one from Rockbourne that I mentioned earlier. There's no getting away from the fact that they are predominantly found associated with infant burials, both cremations and inhumations. The large cemetery at Pepper Hill had 5 examples, 1 cremation and 4 inhumations. And where the bone was present, the individuals were identified again as infants or young children. Could I have the next slide? As you can see here, this is an example from Cirencester. They are quite often actually accompanied by rather unusual objects. So here we have one with a rather lovely enamelled cockerel figurine, again in the grave of a child aged 2 to 3. At Harlow, the site in Essex that I mentioned earlier, the ASE have been doing, it's a rural farmstead type occupation. In the ditch, there's 4 cremations, one of which contain 2 feeding cups, plus a large number of Samian vessels, 2 flagons, 2 corseware beakers, or small jars, plus glass beads and a possible copper-handled bowl or dish. Could you press next slide again? And here, this is a small group of infant cremations at Kingswood in Surrey. There's 5 infant burials here in this little group. One of them had no pots. Burial 2 is quite interesting, and on the slide, it's vessels 6 and 1. And around the base of the urn actually had been placed 24 worked flints had been placed around the base. We're interested in burial 3, which was described as a very young baby. And the remains were in vessel 2 on your screen and accompanied by the little bottle number 5. And interestingly, in this group as well, most of the pottery on site was grog tempered. There was some Samian, but one of the burials, as you can see here, if you look at number 3, that vessel was actually described as an unglazed St. Remy vessel. So again, you know, a type of usually glazed, lead glazed ware, and they do occur in graves, so and may have a votive use. But again, it's interesting that it's in this small little group. Probably the best well-known example is that of the Colchester Child's Grave, which had a huge assortment of finds. Hella Eckhart's article in Britannia 1999 is a really good description. of that one. There wasn't actually any human remains, but it was assumed to be a child's grave based on the presence of one of these bottles and some of the other finds. And when I'm talking about young infant, by young infant, I mean sort of 0 to 6 months, but they can be present with children up to 5 years of age. For example, the one in Cirencester. And to date, I've only found one example where these vessels have actually been used to contain the cremated remains. Could I have the next slide, please? It's actually 2 vessels and 1 site. And it'd be interesting to know, actually, given that these vessels occur so commonly in Gaul, it would be interesting to know if any of our colleagues here have got examples of them actually being used to contain the remains. These are on display in Warrington Museum, and the archive states, in a reference from Roman Cheshire in 1886, 2 curious tettine or feeding bottles for infants have been found made of common redware. They seem from their upright position and contents to have contained the ashes of infants. The handle of one was suited by its position for the right hand of the nurse and the other for the left. And again, although the remains haven't been analysed in detail, I kind of like that the handles are on separate sides of the spout. They do kind of look like a pair. And they were found together, this apparent interment in 1869. At the time, they were thought to be the first examples found in Britain. Next slide. So what do we know of Roman feeding practices, and are we right to assume this function? There are a fair few writers of the Roman world, who had views on breastfeeding and made their views known. Probably the most well-known being the 2 here on the screen. General agreement was that breastfeeding was best for children, but as today, there were conflicting views within this, particularly around whether or not to actually feed the baby immediately after birth. So there were, however, general agreements over weaning and exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 to 7 months when the first tuss emerges, with full weaning by 2 years. So not that dissimilar to modern guidance. But weaning would have been an incredibly dangerous period, and there is a possibility of a second infant mortality peak here, and that's certainly been suggested in some of the literature. And if these vessels, thinking back to the pictures I showed earlier, if these vessels were being used to contain anything other than water, then, they could have posed a considerable risk to the health of an infant. Stable isotope analysis, as I mentioned at the start, they've been used to look at weaning. So the nitrogen values decrease as infants consume less breast milk in favour of more solid food, or other foodstuffs. And most studies have looked at infants, but there was a study of 5 adults, referred to as childhood survivors, at the Roman settlement near Catterick. And that showed exclusive breastfeeding ended around 6 months, with weaning completed between 2 to 5 years, with 3 of the adults fully weaned after the age of 4. And there's a number of other studies that have shown that in the Romano-British period, breastfeeding does appear to have lasted longer than in the preceding Iron Age and in the subsequent early medieval periods, as did the period of complementary feeding. We also have representations in art of infant nursing, and Maureen Carroll has written extensively on these displays within funerary architecture. And could I have the next slide, please? And this is where we get into are they infant feeders or are they lamps? But what I like about this example, it's one of the ones found from the House of Coloured Capitals in Pompeii in the 19th century, the house in the Museum of Naples. And I'm not sure how clear it is on the screen for you to see, but the depiction is of infant feeding. But what we don't have is, and if anybody has any more images, this would be great, but we don't seem to have any contemporary images of feeding using a vessel. If I could have the next slide, please. Here we go. This is the only one that I've managed to track down, and this was through the help of Twitter. It's a 5th century BC figurine, and you can see here that it looks like the infant is being fed from a vessel. Lipid analysis. Lipid analysis on vessels from the Bronze Age and Iron Age infant graves in Bavaria, Germany. And they've shown traces of ruminant milk, so cow, sheep or goat. There's one possibly for human breast milk. Other studies on Roman vessels on the continent have shown evidence of mixed contents. So I believe it's traces of milk fats, but also some evidence of honey and grape extract, I believe, although I'm hoping Julie Dunn is in the audience and can answer questions about this. But while we are talking about the continent, could I have the next slide, please? I mentioned, sorry, these are some late Bronze Age, early Iron Age feeding bottles, familiar looking shapes. These vessels do occur across the empire. And could I have the next slide? The Gallo-Roman villa of Madame de Beaumont had a group of 26 burials, all infants under the age of 6 months, the majority dated AD 90 to 120. And within this group, 4 burials contained, they're referred to as biberon in the literature, out of a total of 47 vessels, so 8.5%. And actually within this collection, the funerary assemblage was mainly jugs. Bowls and cups were significantly less common. So it's interesting, this whole emphasis on liquid containers in funerary deposits. And we don't get these vessels occurring with adults, which has implications for another possible function that's been suggested as invalid cups. And that's been suggested again, given their association, certainly in Britain, with sites with a strong military focus. I won't go back through the slides, but if you remember the slide of the map that I showed towards the beginning of the presentation. And in terms of use, although the vessels showed traces of milk and other substances, does that actually mean that they were used in daily life, or did they simply hold an offering at the point in which they were deposited? The vessel that I showed from Cirencester in the report, there's a comment that actually the vessel could have been deposited not long after manufacture in the 2nd century, to do with what's known of the history of the local industry there. And were these vessels simply deemed a suitable child-sized liquid container? The vessel from Surrey was described as being devoid of soil and presumably bunged, possibly with wood, so it could have contained an offering. And the perforation in the spout is incredibly small, and for older children being given supplementary food, it could work akin to a modern sippy cup. But as a replacement for exclusive breastfeeding, as has been postulated for the prehistoric examples, I'm not convinced, partly due to the practicalities of babies latching onto the hard ceramic teat, certainly much less a glass version. And I think if there's anybody who's ever tried to unlatch a baby while it's breastfeeding, the force of suction is quite impressive. And also, the difficulties of cleaning these vessels, which has been highlighted before, and the risk of infection. If you've got the use of wet nurses, that would seem a far safer alternative if they were available. Other theories that have been put forward use these vessels being used as a breast pump. I'll leave that one there. Could they have some form of, or be involved in some form of comfort or cleanliness regime for infants? Could they have another health use, maybe for like dripping oil in ears, or, did they have a different function to that we assume from where they've been deposited? Were they multifunctional vessels? They do seem to, the evidence does seem to be showing that they do perform some kind of more specialist or child-focused role that we're not maybe aware of at the moment. So I just wanted to give you, because of everything that's been happening over the last year or so, I'm not as far ahead with this research as I would have liked to have been. So I still thought it would be useful to do a sort of a recap of where we are and where the vessels, how many vessels we have now in Britain. So I was going to end actually with, I've just seen the comment about artificial teats. Yeah, I don't know of any evidence of an artificial teat. I mean, there was that quote from Serenus that was on the slide about them being fed through artificial teats. And I'm trying to work out in my mind how you could have secured an artificial teat over the spout to make it softer without babies then actually just sucking that artificial teat off the bottle. I can't quite see how that would work, but I'm happy to be corrected. So yeah, and what I would, could I have the next slide, please? Just before we finish. And again, I want to say thank you to everybody who's helped me with this, the museum curators who've been rummaging around in their collections and pulling out things and checking things for me, because obviously we're not able to visit at the moment, and members of the SGRP. There's my Twitter and my email address. If anybody's got any examples, then they would like to contact me afterwards.